Christianity is often presented as a religion that arrived fully formed, as if it descended straight from the heavens with its rituals, festivals, and moral code untouched by human influence. But the history of Christianity tells a very different story. When it spread across Europe, it didn't simply erase the beliefs and traditions that were already there. It absorbed them, reshaped them, and gave them new names. Christianity changed pagan traditions, but it also depended on them for survival. What people practice today under the label of Christianity often has little to do with what its earliest followers believed, and far more to do with the cultures it conquered and assimilated. When Christianity emerged in the 1st century, the Roman Empire was a vast world of religious diversity. Paganism wasn't one unified religion, but a wide range of local gods, seasonal festivals, and community rituals that gave people structure and meaning. The challenge for Christianity was not only to gain followers, but to compete with traditions that were deeply woven into the lives of entire populations. It was nearly impossible to convince people to abandon their festivals, their rituals for the harvest, or their celebrations of the natural cycles of the earth. So rather than eliminate them, Christian leaders repurposed them. This process is why so many Christian practices today look suspiciously similar to much older pagan customs. Take the celebration of Christmas. Most Christians are taught that December 25th is the birthday of Jesus. Yet the Bible gives no such date, and early Christian communities debated when, or even if, the birth should be celebrated. What mattered was that December 25th already carried great symbolic meaning in the pagan world. It was tied to the winter solstice, when the days began to lengthen again and the sun returned after the darkest point of the year. Romans celebrated Saturnalia in December, a holiday marked by feasting, gift-giving, and social reversal. The cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, held its festival on December 25th. By placing Jesus' birth on this date, Christian leaders ensured that people could continue their cherished winter festivities, only now rebranded under a new religious story. Christmas trees, mistletoe, holly, and even the idea of decorating homes with evergreen plants all trace back to pre-Christian pagan customs. These symbols of life during winter were not invented by Christianity. They were adopted to make the new faith more familiar and easier to accept. The same pattern appears with Easter. Modern Easter celebrations combine the resurrection story of Jesus with traditions that clearly come from older fertility rites. The very word Easter is linked to Eostre, a Germanic goddess of spring and fertility. Eggs and rabbits, both symbols of fertility, were never Christian in origin. They belonged to seasonal celebrations marking renewal and the return of life after winter. Christianity grafted its central resurrection narrative onto a framework that people already celebrated, ensuring continuity between old and new. The resurrection became layered over a festival of renewal, blending mythologies in a way that made it easier for pagan converts to embrace the new religion without abandoning their familiar rhythms. Even the weekly rhythm of Christian life reflects adaptation. Sunday worship was not practiced by the earliest Jewish followers of Jesus, who kept the Sabbath on Saturday. But Sunday already held significance in Roman culture as the day of the sun, dedicated to the solar deities. By shifting worship to this day, Christianity aligned itself with existing patterns of life in the empire, helping its communities blend in while subtly redefining the meaning of the day. Over time, the pagan sun god's day became the Christian Lord's Day. The cross, now the most recognizable Christian symbol, also illustrates this pattern of adaptation. Early Christians were hesitant to use the cross because crucifixion was associated with shame and punishment. Instead, they used symbols like the fish. But the cross gained popularity as Christianity absorbed ideas from surrounding cultures, where crosses in similar shapes already held symbolic power as signs of life, the cosmos, or the meeting of divine and human. When Christianity rose to dominance, It redefined the cross from a Roman tool of execution into a universal emblem of salvation. But the psychological weight of the symbol had already existed in earlier traditions. What is striking is not only how Christianity changed pagan traditions, but how much it relied on them. Missionaries who traveled through Europe didn't tell local populations to abandon their sacred groves, wells, and shrines. Instead, they built churches on top of them. Archaeological evidence shows that countless early churches were placed directly over pagan sites of worship. This was deliberate. By absorbing the spiritual landscape rather than destroying it, Christianity presented itself as a continuation rather than a replacement. People could keep gathering at the same sacred place, only now under the authority of a new God. The same happened with saints. In many cases, Christian saints took the roles once played by local deities. A goddess who protected travelers might be replaced by a saint who watched over journeys. A god associated with healing might be replaced by a saint known for miracles. This blending allowed old habits to survive under a new label, making conversion less disruptive. In reality, people were still practicing many of the same rituals, only now they were told they were doing it in the name of Christ. Even the structure of Christian festivals throughout the year reflects pagan influence. The calendar of feasts closely mirrors the agricultural cycles that were central to pagan life. Christianity absorbed these rhythms so thoroughly that many people today forget they were ever pagan. Candlemas, All Saints' Day, and other Christian festivals often coincide with older Celtic or Roman celebrations. These strategic choices allowed Christianity to map itself onto people's lives in a way that felt natural and inevitable. What this reveals is that Christianity was never the pure, untouched system it is often claimed to be. It grew by changing what already existed. Pagan traditions were not erased. They were baptized. And in doing so, Christianity presented itself as universal and timeless, even though it was built on borrowed foundations. This strategy worked. By disguising continuity as transformation, it made conversion less threatening and more appealing. It offered people the comfort of keeping their customs while convincing them they were now serving a higher truth. But this blending came with consequences. When Christianity rebranded pagan traditions, it also distorted them. Ancient festivals that celebrated nature, fertility, and community became tied to narratives of sin, salvation, and divine authority. The winter solstice, once a joyous marker of light returning, became a religious story about a savior's birth. Fertility rites celebrating renewal became theological lessons about resurrection. What was once grounded in natural cycles became tied to supernatural claims. Christianity not only changed pagan traditions, it also rewrote human memory. Over generations, people forgot the original meanings of their rituals and came to believe they had always belonged to the Christian story. Today, millions celebrate Christmas, without realizing they are reenacting solstice traditions that predate Christianity by centuries. They hunt for Easter eggs without knowing these symbols once belonged to a pagan goddess. They light candles for saints without realizing these practices were once offerings to older deities. This rewriting of history was not accidental. Early Christian leaders understood the power of myth and ritual. They knew that people rarely abandoned their traditions willingly. So they absorbed them, attached new meanings, and erased the memory of their origins. What was once pagan became Christian, and people forgot the difference. This was not simply a matter of religious adaptation. It was a strategy of cultural control. By taking ownership of festivals, symbols, and sacred spaces, Christianity claimed authority not only over belief, but over time, memory, and community life. The scale of this transformation is hard to overstate. Consider how deeply Christmas and Easter shape entire economies today. Billions are spent each year on holidays rooted in pagan customs that Christianity rebranded. These are not just religious events. They are cultural engines that shape family life, consumer behavior, and national calendars. Yet their foundations reveal how little of what people think of as Christian is actually original to Christianity. And this raises an uncomfortable truth. If Christianity depended so heavily on reshaping pagan traditions to grow, how much of its authority really comes from divine truth? If its most cherished rituals and holidays were borrowed, altered, and disguised, then what does that say about its claim to uniqueness? It suggests that Christianity was not the revelation of eternal truths, but a human construction, one that grew by adapting whatever it needed to survive. The absorption of pagan traditions into Christianity was not limited to festivals and holidays. It shaped the very way Christianity taught morality and order. Pagan societies often had rituals tied to the land, seasons, and cycles of fertility. These were not only about worship, but about survival, ensuring good harvests and the prosperity of the community. Christianity repurposed these rituals, but replaced their meaning with obedience to divine will. What was once a communal acknowledgement of nature's cycles became a story of humanity's dependence on a supernatural authority. In this way, Christianity did not just take over traditions, it redirected their power toward itself. The church became an institution that claimed control over time itself. The old pagan calendars were based on solstices, equinoxes, and the agricultural year. Christianity kept these markers but reframed them. The year now began with Christ's birth. The spring was marked by his resurrection, and saints' days filled the calendar in between. The church turned every significant season into a religious commemoration, claiming mastery over the flow of human life. The rhythm of existence, once tied to the natural world, was made to orbit around the church's story. In rural areas, where pagan traditions were strongest, the church often allowed local customs to continue under thin Christian disguises. Bonfires that had long marked the solstice became associated with St. John's Day. Harvest festivals became feasts of Christian saints. Wells and springs once dedicated to goddesses were rebranded as holy wells blessed by the Virgin Mary. The names changed, but the practices remained. This wasn't a mistake or a weakness. It was a calculated way to ensure Christianity seemed familiar enough to be accepted while tightening its grip over time. Even art and architecture reveal how Christianity built itself on pagan traditions. Columns, domes, and arches in early churches mirrored Roman temples. Many Christian mosaics show Christ surrounded by sun rays, a direct borrowing from solar imagery used for Apollo and Sol Invictus. In some of the earliest depictions, Christ is shown riding a chariot across the sky, a scene taken almost directly from pagan art of the sun god. Over time, these images were given new interpretations, but the pagan influence is clear. The very way Christianity presented its god visually was shaped by older gods. This blending wasn't just cultural, it was political. Pagan festivals were moments when communities gathered and leaders understood their power. By taking control of these gatherings, Christianity gained authority over public life. It is easier to dominate people when you dictate not only what they believe, but when they gather, what they celebrate, and how they mark the passing of time. By reshaping pagan traditions, Christianity transformed itself from a small sect into the cultural backbone of Europe. But while Christianity absorbed so much, it also demonized what it couldn't control. Pagan gods were recast as demons. Old fertility rituals were labeled immoral. Sacred groves were chopped down, and their spirits condemned as evil. The very word pagan became a slur, meaning backward, uneducated, or ungodly. This was part of the strategy. People were allowed to keep their customs, but they had to accept Christian authority. Those who resisted were painted as enemies of truth. This mix of tolerance and condemnation created a strange legacy. On one hand, Christianity carried pagan traditions forward into the modern world. On the other, it erased their original meaning and taught generations to see them as sinful if practiced outside the church's control. The result is that today, countless traditions people think of as harmless fun, decorating a tree, hunting for eggs, lighting candles at shrines, are fragments of pagan customs that survived only because Christianity disguised them. Consider Halloween. Today, it is framed as a secular holiday of costumes and candy, but its roots go much deeper. The Celtic festival of Samhain marked the end of the harvest and the transition to winter, a time when the boundary between the living and the dead was believed to thin. Christianity could not erase such a powerful tradition, so it created All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, placing them right after Samhain. The result was a blend of Christian prayers for the dead with older pagan rituals of honoring ancestors and warding off spirits. Over time, the old meanings faded, but the practices remained. The costumes, bonfires, and offerings survived under new names. Even the veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus, reflects how Christianity absorbed pagan traditions. In many cultures, goddesses of fertility, love, and protection were central to worship. As Christianity spread, Mary took on many of these roles. In regions once devoted to goddesses like Isis, Artemis, or Freya, devotion to Mary flourished. She became the compassionate figure who intercedes, the motherly presence who listens, much like the goddesses she replaced. To this day, Marian shrines across Europe are often located at sites that were once sacred to pagan deities. Christianity didn't just tolerate people's need for divine femininity, it redirected it to Mary. This constant reshaping raises a profound question. If Christianity is supposed to be based on eternal, unchanging truth, why did it need to borrow so much? Why did it have to absorb festivals, symbols, and rituals from the very traditions it condemned? The answer is that without these adaptations, Christianity might never have spread. It needed pagan traditions because people cling to their customs. A religion that demanded total abandonment would have been rejected. But by disguising continuity as transformation, Christianity made conversion palatable. Some defenders argue that Christianity fulfilled pagan traditions, rather than stole them. But fulfillment is just another word for appropriation. The truth is that Christianity survived by attaching itself to existing human practices, stripping them of their old meaning, and replacing them with its narrative. This reveals religion's deeply human origin. It shows that Christianity did not emerge from divine revelation, but from cultural borrowing, political strategy, and pragmatic compromise. The persistence of these traditions today also shows how shallow the church's control really was. Despite centuries of theology, people still celebrate festivals in ways that echo their pagan past. Families still gather around trees in winter. Children still search for eggs in spring. And communities still light bonfires at seasonal transitions. These practices carry meanings that reach deeper than doctrine. They speak to human connections with nature, community, and cycles of life, things that existed long before Christianity and will likely outlast it. What Christianity did was wrap these traditions in a story that claimed divine authority. But peel back the layers, and the older roots are obvious. The decorated Christmas tree has nothing to do with Bethlehem. The Easter bunny has nothing to do with Jerusalem. The bonfires of midsummer have nothing to do with saints. These are fragments of human culture that Christianity rebranded to ensure survival. And yet, many believers today see these traditions as proof of Christianity's richness and universality. They mistake borrowed symbols for divine depth. They point to the beauty of Christmas without realizing they are celebrating something far older than the nativity story. They embrace Easter as a holy event without noticing its pagan echoes. This is the irony. The strength of Christian culture rests not on its originality, but on its ability to camouflage itself in other people's traditions. This camouflage also reveals the church's fear of being irrelevant. If Christianity truly carried a unique truth, it wouldn't need to borrow. It wouldn't need to disguise itself in solstices, equinoxes, and pagan rituals. The fact that it did shows how fragile it was in its early days and how dependent it was on the people it sought to convert. The merging of pagan traditions with Christianity also reshaped how people understood sacred space. In pagan cultures, sacred places were usually tied to nature: groves of trees, mountain peaks, rivers, caves, and springs. These were places where people felt connected to something larger, often through the rhythms of the natural world. Christianity declared that true holiness could only be found within the church and its sacraments. But rather than erase sacred places outright, the church repurposed them. Shrines that had been dedicated to local deities were rededicated to saints. Natural springs that had been seen as gifts of the earth were renamed holy wells, said to flow with divine blessing. In this way, Christianity didn't eliminate people's reverence for place. It absorbed it, redirected it, and branded it with Christian authority. This strategy extended to the architecture of worship. Early missionaries understood that people would not easily abandon the temples and sacred sites that anchored their communities. So many churches were constructed on top of older pagan sites. Archaeologists have uncovered countless examples of Christian churches deliberately placed where temples once stood. In Rome, churches were often built on the ruins of pagan temples, signaling to people that their old gods had been defeated, but also ensuring continuity of place. In the British Isles, churches were raised on sites once devoted to Celtic gods, ensuring that the people's sense of the sacred remained intact, only now controlled by the Christian priesthood. Music, too, was reshaped. Pagan festivals were often filled with dance, chanting, and songs celebrating nature, fertility, or the gods. Christianity condemned many of these as immoral, but it could not extinguish the human need for rhythm and music in ritual. Over time, hymns absorbed the forms of pagan chants and melodies. Instruments that had once accompanied festivals were reintroduced in churches with new lyrics. What people once sang to the gods of harvest, they now sang to the Christian God, though the structure and emotion were strikingly similar. Even the way Christianity presented its saints and martyrs resembled the pagan stories of heroes and demigods. Pagan cultures often told tales of gods or semi-divine beings who sacrificed themselves, performed miracles, or protected their people. Christianity reframed these motifs into stories of saints who endured torture, performed wonders, or defended the faithful. The overlap is not accidental. Human beings resonate with certain types of stories. Christianity reused the structures of pagan myth, but attached them to its own figures, giving people narratives they already understood, while teaching them to abandon the gods behind those stories. The transformation of time itself was one of Christianity's most powerful strategies. Pagan calendars revolved around solstices, harvests, and the cycles of planting. Christianity inserted its festivals at these turning points. By aligning Christ's birth with the solstice, his resurrection with spring, and saints' feasts with harvest times, the church ensured that it controlled the most meaningful moments in people's lives. This wasn't only about worship, it was about power. Whoever controls the calendar controls memory, community, and the rhythm of existence. Pagan traditions survived, but only under Christian supervision. Over the centuries, this reshaping created a paradox. People believed they were practicing Christianity, but much of what they did was pagan in origin. Lighting candles at an altar, kissing relics, or carrying charms for protection were not Christian inventions. These practices came from older traditions of honoring gods, spirits, and ancestors. The church alternated between condemning them and tolerating them, depending on whether they could be rebranded in Christian terms. In this way, superstition and ritual that predated Christianity lived on inside the religion that claimed to replace them. The treatment of women's spiritual roles also reveals how Christianity changed pagan traditions. In many pre-Christian cultures, priestesses and female figures had central roles in religious life. Goddesses represented fertility, wisdom, love, and the cycles of nature. Christianity absorbed this need by elevating the figure of Mary and female saints, but it stripped women of real spiritual authority. What had been a position of leadership in pagan traditions became reduced to symbolic veneration in Christianity. Women could be honored in story, but men held the power in ritual and hierarchy. Christianity reshaped traditions in a way that preserved the symbols, but eliminated the freedom behind them. The Church's rebranding of pagan traditions was not just clever, it was necessary. Without this adaptation, it is doubtful that Christianity would have replaced the old religions of Europe. Human beings hold tightly to rituals, festivals, and sacred places. These are not easily erased because they anchor identity and community. Christianity's success came not from originality, but from its willingness to bend, borrow, and reframe. Its leaders were pragmatic, not visionary. They took what people already loved and told them it belonged to Christ. But there is another side to this story. While Christianity absorbed pagan traditions, it also distorted them. Nature festivals that once celebrated abundance and fertility were reframed as lessons about sin and redemption. Community rituals of renewal became tied to theological claims about salvation. What was once a joyful recognition of life's cycles was turned into a moral narrative about humanity's fall and need for divine rescue. Christianity didn't just borrow traditions. It changed their meaning in ways that reinforced its own authority and diminished their connection to the natural world. This shift had long-term consequences. By severing traditions from their natural roots, Christianity weakened humanity's connection to the cycles of the earth. Instead of seeing the solstice as a celebration of light's return, people were taught to see it as a story of a Savior's birth. Instead of honoring fertility and renewal directly, they were taught to see them as metaphors for resurrection. Christianity placed supernatural stories on top of natural realities, distancing people from the world around them. This is why, even today, Christian festivals feel strangely detached from the natural cycles they were built upon. The irony is that the survival of many traditions we enjoy today, festivals, symbols, rituals, was only possible because Christianity disguised them. Without this camouflage, the Church might have wiped them out completely. Yet by rebranding them, Christianity preserved fragments of pagan culture inside its own framework. That is why modern people still celebrate solstice festivals without knowing it, still mark fertility rites in spring without understanding their origin, and still gather around bonfires that were once lit for gods long forgotten. This raises a deeper point about religion itself. If Christianity could absorb pagan traditions so easily, it shows that religions are not fixed systems of truth, but flexible frameworks that adapt to survive. They do not descend untouched from the divine. They evolve, borrow, and reshape themselves depending on what works. The history of how Christianity changed pagan traditions is evidence that religions are human inventions, constantly negotiating with culture rather than revealing eternal truths. Christianity's story, then, is not one of purity, but of synthesis. It did not erase paganism, but consumed it. It stitched together fragments of older beliefs, wove them into a new narrative, and claimed them as its own. And yet, those older traditions still shine through the cracks. Every Christmas tree, every Easter egg, every candle lit for a saint is a reminder of the cultures that existed long before Christianity. Cultures that refused to die and instead lived on beneath new names. The blending of pagan traditions into Christianity also explains why the religion took on such different forms in different regions. In Northern Europe, where the winters were long and harsh, evergreen plants, fires, and rituals of renewal became central symbols of Christian practice. In the Mediterranean, imagery of the sun, grapes, and bread carried over from pagan celebrations of harvest and wine gods. In Celtic regions, bonfires and ancestor rituals remained, only now given Christian explanations. Christianity did not spread as one uniform system. It bent itself to local customs, wearing different masks in different lands, always presenting itself as eternal truth, while quietly borrowing from the very practices it denounced. One of the most revealing examples is the Festival of Carnival. Today, it is celebrated in many Christian countries as a time of feasting and excess before Lent. But its roots lie in pagan spring festivals, where people reversed social roles, dressed in costumes, and engaged in rituals of chaos before returning to order. Christianity could not erase this instinct for release, so it absorbed it, framing it as a temporary indulgence before 40 days of fasting. The tradition survived, but its meaning was twisted. What had once been a celebration of balance between chaos and order became a reminder of human sinfulness and the need for discipline. This process repeated across centuries. Pagan midwinter feasts became Christmas. Spring fertility rites became Easter. Harvest festivals became saints' days. Bonfires for solstices became feast days of John or Peter. And ancestor veneration became All Souls' Day. The result is a religion that appears coherent on the surface, but is actually a mosaic of borrowed fragments. What this reveals is how religion evolves not through revelation, but through adaptation. Christianity had no choice but to adapt. Without these transformations, it would have remained a small sect, overshadowed by the gods and traditions that had been practiced for generations. Its survival depended on its ability to camouflage itself inside the very practices it condemned. That camouflage worked so well that today, billions participate in pagan rituals without even realizing it. But this history also exposes the contradictions of Christian teaching. On one hand, the church claimed that pagan gods were false and their rituals sinful. On the other, it borrowed their festivals, symbols, and sacred spaces to strengthen itself. The church condemned the worship of nature, yet it built its holiest days around nature's cycles. It rejected goddess worship, yet it elevated Mary into a role strikingly similar to those same goddesses. It declared pagan practices evil, yet it adopted them to fill its own calendar. This double standard shows how religion often operates, not as a guardian of truth, but as a system willing to twist, reshape, and absorb whatever ensures its dominance. The psychological effect of this should not be underestimated. By disguising pagan traditions as Christian, the church convinced generations that their customs had always belonged to the Christian story. Over time, memory of the older traditions faded. People stopped seeing their rituals as celebrations of the sun, the earth, or fertility, and began to see them as proofs of divine revelation. This manipulation of memory gave the church immense power. It rewrote not just belief, but history itself. Yet fragments of the old truths still break through. Anthropologists and historians can trace the symbols and rituals back to their origins. Archaeology uncovers the temples beneath the churches. Folklore preserves the older meanings beneath the surface of Christian stories. These reminders show that the roots of human ritual lie deeper than any single religion. They belong not to Christianity, but to humanity itself. The irony is that Christianity, which claims to be the one true faith, is one of the best examples of how religions are built on human invention. Its calendar, its festivals, its symbols, all reveal a patchwork of cultural borrowing. And once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to look at Christianity as something unique. It is just another layer in the long story of human attempts to explain the world. A layer that covered older traditions, but could never completely erase them. Even today, when people insist on the uniqueness of Christian holidays, the evidence tells a different story. The decorated tree in December is not Christian. The painted egg in spring is not Christian. The bonfire in summer is not Christian. These are ancient human expressions of joy, survival, and renewal that Christianity claimed for itself. They are reminders that long before the Bible, human beings had already found ways to celebrate the cycles of life. This recognition changes how we see Christianity's place in history. It is not the end of religious development, as it often claims, but one stage among many. Just as it absorbed pagan traditions, it too will one day be absorbed, replaced, or rebranded by whatever comes next. Human culture is always evolving. Traditions outlive the religions that try to own them. The solstice will be celebrated as long as the sun rises and sets, regardless of whether people attach it to Christ, Sol Invictus, or no God at all. Fertility will always be honored in spring, regardless of whether it is framed as resurrection or renewal. The earth's cycles do not need divine stories to give them meaning. They already carry meaning in themselves. This is the ultimate truth hidden beneath Christianity's camouflage. The rituals people practice are not proof of divine authority. They are proof of human resilience. They are fragments of ancient cultures that refuse to vanish, carried forward under new names, surviving even when their original gods were condemned. Christianity changed pagan traditions, but those traditions also changed Christianity. They kept it alive, gave it symbols, and ensured its spread. Without them, Christianity would not be recognizable today. And so, every time people gather for Christmas, every time they paint eggs in spring, every time they light a candle for a saint, they are not just practicing Christianity. They are participating in something much older, something that belongs to humanity rather than to any one religion. They are keeping alive the rituals that Christianity tried to claim but could never truly own. That is the hidden story of how Christianity changed pagan traditions, and how those traditions, in turn, changed Christianity.